The champagne glass shattered against marble, and my son-in-law laughed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The coffee was still hot when I pulled the property deed from my desk drawer. 38 years old, the paper soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded so many times in the early days. The ink had faded slightly, but the signatures were clear, mine and Margaret's, witnessed by a notary in a strip mall office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. I set it beside her photograph. Margaret at 43, silver just starting to thread through her hair, wearing that lavender dress she'd loved. The same dress she wore the day we closed on the lake house, the property that would change everything, though we didn't know it then. He has no idea, I said to her smile. None of them do. My hands wrapped around the mug, calloused from the years I'd worked construction, spotted with age now, but steady. These hands had poured concrete foundations, framed houses in freezing rain, held drafting pencils late into the night, while Margaret kept the books and believed when the bank wouldn't. 42 years I'd built Richardson Construction and Development. From a two-man crew to 200 employees. From rented equipment and borrowed trucks to 8 figures in holdings. We'd developed residential properties across 3 counties, built everything from starter homes to luxury estates. Margaret had been there for every foundation, every risk, every midnight when I thought we'd lose it all. Now she was gone. 3 years, and the house still felt empty. Our daughter Sarah had married Blake Morrison 6 years ago. Blake was a corporate attorney, smooth, expensive suits, perfect hair, the kind of man who'd never swung a hammer or earned a callus. He worked at Morrison & Hale, his father's firm, making partner on a path that had been cleared for him since birth. I'd never warmed to him, but Sarah loved him, and Margaret had wanted her happy, so I kept my reservations quiet. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, "Don't forget tonight. 7 p.m. at the estate. Mom would want you there." The estate. Blake's word for the lakefront property, 4 acres, 6,000 square feet, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. The kind of house that showed up in luxury magazines. The house I'd built for Margaret. The house that sat on land I still owned. I dressed in my gray suit, the same one I wore to Margaret's funeral, to business meetings, to every occasion requiring formality. The money sat in investments, in properties, in the business. I still lived in the house where we'd raised Sarah, still drove the 15-year-old Ford F-150 that ran perfectly well. The estate sat at the end of a private drive, lit up like a resort. Catering vans lined the circular driveway. Through the windows, I could see 50 people in evening wear, drinking wine that probably cost more per bottle than I'd made in a day when I was starting out. Blake's anniversary party. 5 years of marriage, celebrated like visiting royalty. I made my way through the crowd. Sarah found me first, beautiful in a silver dress, her mother's eyes looking out from her face. "Dad," she hugged me. "I'm so glad you came. Wouldn't miss it, sweetheart." Blake appeared, a champagne flute in each hand. He wore a tuxedo that probably cost what I used to pay my crew for a week's work. His smile was practiced, professional, the kind you gave clients. "Robert, good of you to make it." He didn't offer champagne. "Sarah, the Hendersons want to see the wine cellar." "In a minute. I'm talking to Dad. They're potential clients for the firm. Don't keep them waiting." It wasn't a request. Sarah squeezed my hand and moved toward a waiting couple. Blake turned to me. "Try to mingle, Robert. I know these events aren't your style, but Sarah wanted you here." "I'm here for Sarah. And for Margaret's memory." Something flickered in his expression. "Of course. Though I sometimes wonder if Margaret would have wanted Sarah to move past the old neighborhood. Mentality. No offense, but this," he gestured at the estate, "this is a different caliber of life." A cluster of Blake's colleagues approached. Attorneys, judges, a city councilman. They surrounded him, offering congratulations on the anniversary, on a recent case he'd won, on the estate itself. "This house is remarkable, Blake," one woman said. "The location alone must be worth millions." "For 0.2 acres of prime lakefront," Blake said. "We were lucky to find it. The previous owner had no idea what they were sitting on." I stood 3 feet away. He knew I was there. "Smart investment," the councilman said. "Property values on this lake have tripled in 5 years." "Indeed. Though it's less about investment and more about lifestyle." Blake's voice carried across the group. "Sarah deserves the best. Unlike her upbringing, she now has access to the kind of society and culture that actually matters." The words hung in the air like smoke. A judge laughed. Well, not everyone can raise children with sophistication. Some people are just simpler. Blake smiled. Didn't correct him. Didn't defend Margaret or me. He just accepted another champagne flute from a passing waiter. I looked at the walls around us. Walls I'd framed myself, drywall I'd hung, floors I'd finished. Margaret had chosen every detail, planned every room for the daughter she loved. Then Sarah appeared, leading Margaret's sister Ruth through the crowd. Ruth was 78, walked with a cane, wore a dress she'd probably owned for 20 years. Margaret's last living sibling. Blake's expression tightened. Sarah, I thought we discussed the guest list. Aunt Ruth is family. She's not exactly. Blake glanced at his colleagues. She doesn't fit the aesthetic we're maintaining tonight. Ruth heard him. Her face flushed. Sarah's voice dropped. Blake, she drove 3 hours to be here. Then she can enjoy the appetizers in the kitchen with the catering staff. I'm not having her embarrass us in front of the Hendersons. The kitchen. Like hired help. Ruth's eyes filled. She turned toward the door. I caught her arm gently. Ruth, stay. Please. Blake stepped closer, voice low but sharp. Robert, this is my home, my event, my rules. If you can't respect that, you can leave too. In fact, he raised his voice so the nearby guests could hear. I think it's time we acknowledge something. This family has been riding my success for years. Living in my shadow, attending my events, benefiting from my connections. Sarah's father built tract houses. I built a legacy. He gestured at the estate. This is what real success looks like. Not your little construction company, not Margaret's. He paused, searching for a word cruel enough. Her quaint little dreams. The room went quiet. Margaret's quaint little dreams. The woman who'd worked 2 jobs while I built the business. Who'd kept books until 2 a.m. Who'd believed when no one else would. Who'd designed this house, chosen this land, imagined every detail. Quite. Blake picked up a champagne flute, raised it toward his guests. To moving forward. To leaving behind the limitations of. The glass slipped from his hand, shattered against the marble floor Margaret had selected. He laughed. See, even the house knows it's time to celebrate properly. I looked at my daughter. At Ruth's tears. At Blake's smug expression. At the house Margaret never got to live in. Then I pulled out my phone and made a call. David? It's Robert Richardson. I need you at the Morrison estate. Now, bring the documents we discussed. Blake's smile faltered. What documents? I met his eyes. The ones about your house. David Chun arrived 20 minutes later, briefcase in hand. I'd known David for 30 years. He'd handled every property deal, every contract, every legal detail of my business since Margaret and I were scraping together down payments. He was quiet, meticulous, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. Blake stood by the fireplace, surrounded by his colleagues. He'd recovered his composure after my phone call, decided I was bluffing, and continued holding court about his success. Robert, David shook my hand, then looked around the great room with professional appreciation. Beautiful home. Your best work. Margaret's vision. She had excellent taste. He opened his briefcase. Are you certain about this? I thought of Blake's words. Of Ruth's tears. Of quaint little dreams. Completely certain. Sarah approached, confused. Dad, what's going on? Just some business, sweetheart. Why don't you sit down? Blake noticed David. His attorney instincts kicked in. He recognized the briefcase, the posture, the threat. He excused himself from his group and walked over. I don't know what you think you're doing, Robert, but this is inappropriate. This is a private celebration. Actually, David said, this concerns the property itself, which makes it quite appropriate. I don't have business with you. You do now? David pulled out a document. This is a deed. For the 4.2 acres on which this house sits. Filed in 1986. Purchased by Robert and Margaret Richardson for $68,000 when this was undeveloped lakefront that nobody wanted. Blake's face went carefully neutral. That's incorrect. Sarah and I own this property. We bought it 3 years ago from the Hendersons, who'd owned it for decades. You bought the house, David said. Not the land. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. That's impossible. I reviewed every document. My firm handled the closing. Your firm handled the purchase of the structure and improvements. But the land itself, David laid the deed on the coffee table, has always belonged to the Richardsons. The Hendersons leased it on a 99-year ground lease, filed in 1987. When they sold you the house, they sold you their remaining interest in the lease, not the underlying property. Blake grabbed the document, reading frantically. His face drained of color. Sarah looked at me. Dad, I don't understand. Your mother and I bought this land 38 years ago, I said quietly. It was nothing then. Overgrown, no utilities, terrible access road. We paid cash, every dollar we had saved. Margaret loved this spot. She used to bring you here when you were little, before anything was built. She'd sit on that ridge and plan the house she wanted to build someday. My voice caught. I pushed through it. We never had the money to build while she was alive. So we leased the land to the Hendersons in '87. They wanted lakefront for their vacation home. The lease was for 99 years at fair market rate, with the land reverting to us when the lease ended or if they sold the property without our consent to a transfer. Blake was still reading, his hands shaking slightly. You can't. This isn't standard practice. Nobody structures deals this way. We did, I said, because Margaret wanted Sarah to have this land someday. She made me promise that no matter what happened to the business, no matter what we sold or lost, we'd keep this property for our daughter. David pulled out another document. When the Hendersons sold to you 3 years ago, they were required by the lease terms to notify the landowners and offer us the right of first refusal. They didn't, which means the sale violated the lease terms. My firm would have caught that. Your firm did a title search on the improvements, not the land itself. Common oversight when ground leases are involved, especially ones this old. David's voice was clinical. The lease specifies that any unauthorized transfer gives the landowner the right to terminate with 90 days' notice. He laid another document on the table. This is that notice. Filed this morning. Effective in 90 days, the ground lease terminates. At that point, Robert Richardson, as sole surviving landowner, can negotiate a new lease, sell the land, or reclaim it entirely. Blake's colleagues had gone silent, watching the scene unfold. You can't take our house, Blake said. I'm not taking the house. The house is yours, the structure, the improvements, everything you put into it. But it sits on my land. And in 90 days, you'll be occupying that land without permission. Then we'll negotiate a new lease. Name your price. I looked around the great room. At the fireplace Margaret designed. At the windows she'd positioned to catch sunrise over the water. At the built-in shelves where she'd planned to display the books she loved. I don't want your money, Blake. Then what do you want? I want you to understand something. I stood, my voice carrying across the silent room. You called Margaret's dreams quaint. You dismissed the life we built, the work we did, the sacrifices we made. You treated Ruth, Margaret's sister, like hired help. You told our daughter that her upbringing wasn't sophisticated enough. I pulled out my phone, opened the photo gallery. A picture of Margaret, 25 years old, in work boots and a hard hat, standing in front of our first development project. This is the woman whose dreams you mocked. She worked as a bookkeeper, a secretary, a waitress, whatever it took to keep our business alive. She drew the plans for half the houses I built. She negotiated with suppliers when I was too proud to ask for terms. She kept us solvent through recessions, through droughts, through years when I wanted to quit. I showed him another photo. Margaret at 50, wearing that lavender dress, standing on this exact ridge, pointing at where she wanted the house to sit. She designed every room of this estate. She chose the orientation, the materials, the layout. She died before we could afford to build it. But she made me promise that Sarah would have this land, this view, this piece of her mother's vision. My voice hardened. And you moved into her dream and called it your success. You stood in the house she designed and dismissed the woman who created it. You treated her life's work like something to be ashamed of. Blake's face was white. Around us, his colleagues found reasons to study their phones, their drinks, anywhere but the confrontation unfolding. Sarah was crying. Dad, I didn't know. You never told me about the ground lease. I thought. I know, sweetheart. I turned back to Blake. Here are your options. In 90 days, the lease terminates. At that point, you can either negotiate a new lease or remove the structure from my land. A house this size, dismantled and relocated, would cost approximately $2 million and destroy most of its value. Or, Blake's voice was barely audible. David pulled out the final document. Where you accept these terms. Robert negotiates a new 99-year lease at fair market rate, professionally appraised, completely reasonable. but the lease includes covenants. He read them aloud. 1. The property must be named the Margaret Richardson Estate, with a plaque by the entrance commemorating her design and vision. 2. 1 weekend per month. The house must be available for Ruth and other members of Margaret's family to visit and stay at no cost. 3. The wine cellar Margaret plan will be completed and stocked with wines from the vineyard she loved, accessible to family. 4. Photos of Margaret and the original property will be displayed in the main hall, with a description of her role in creating the estate. 5. You will write a letter to Sarah, to Ruth, and to every person present tonight, apologizing for your comments about Margaret and acknowledging her contributions to this property and to your wife's upbringing. 6. You will make a donation of $50,000 to the community college where Margaret taught night classes for 15 years, establishing the Margaret Richardson Scholarship for working students. Blake stared at the document like it was written in a foreign language. These terms are non-negotiable, David said. Accept them by 5 p.m. tomorrow, and Robert will execute a new 99-year lease at standard rates. Refuse, and in 90 days, you'll be trespassing on his property. This is extortion. This is contract law, David said. You bought a house on leased land without proper due diligence. The lease terms are clear. Robert is offering you a fair path forward that honors his late wife's memory. Or you can hire your own attorney and spend the next year in litigation while living in a house you may have to demolish. I picked up Margaret's photograph from where I'd set it on the side table. I'd brought it with me, though I hadn't planned to take it out. Your choice, Blake. You can accept that this house exists because of Margaret's vision and sacrifice, or you can fight me and lose everything she created. I walked toward the door. Sarah followed. Dad, wait. I turned. My daughter's face was torn between loyalty and grief. Did Mom really design all of this? Every detail. She drew sketches for years. She knew exactly how she wanted the light to fall, which trees to preserve, where to position each room. I touched her cheek. She wanted you to have something beautiful, something that would last. I never knew. Blake never asked. I left her standing in the house her mother built, surrounded by people who'd never known Margaret, had never valued her, had never understood what it cost to create something from nothing. Ruth waited by my truck. I drove her home through the dark, neither of us speaking until we reached her driveway. Margaret would be proud of you, she said. I should have done it sooner. You did it when it mattered. She squeezed my hand. That's enough. At home, I sat with Margaret's photograph and the original deed, both in their places on my desk. I kept my promise, I told her, smile. Sarah will have the land, but she'll know whose dream it was. The house settled around me, quiet and familiar. My phone buzzed at 4:42 p.m. the next day. A text from Blake. I'll sign. All of it. The plaque was installed 3 weeks later. Bronze, mounted on river rock beside the main entrance. The Margaret Richardson Estate. Designed and envisioned by Margaret Richardson, 1951 to 2021. Built on land she loved and preserved for her family. I stood in front of it with Sarah on a cool October morning. The kind of morning Margaret had loved. Mist rising off the lake. Geese calling overhead. Everything quiet and clean. Tell me about her, Sarah said. About when she planned this. We walked down to the ridge where Margaret used to sit. I'd brought folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, the same way Margaret and I used to do when this was just empty land and impossible dreams. She'd bring you here when you were 4, 5 years old, I said. You'd play by the water while she sketched. She had a notebook, I still have it, full of drawings. Room layouts, window placements, where she wanted gardens. Why didn't you ever build it? Couldn't afford to. We were pouring everything into the business, into keeping crews working, into your college fund. I sipped coffee, watching the mist. She said it didn't matter. She said knowing it was here, knowing someday you'd have this place, that was enough. Sarah was quiet for a long time. Blake and I are in counseling, she said finally. That's your decision. He says he wants to change, that he didn't understand what he was saying, how it sounded. She looked at the house. But I keep thinking about Mom being erased, about him taking credit for her work. Your mother didn't need credit, but she deserved respect. Do you think? Sarah's voice broke. Do you think she'd want me to leave him? I took my daughter's hand. Your mother wanted you happy. If Blake can become a man worthy of you, a man who values where you came from, who honors the people who built what he enjoys, then she'd support that. But she'd never want you with someone who made you ashamed of your family or yourself. I'm not ashamed. I was never ashamed. I know, sweetheart. We sat together as the sun burned through the mist. Eventually, Sarah went back to the house. I stayed on the ridge, where Margaret used to dream. My phone rang. David Chun. The donation cleared, he said. The scholarship fund is established. First recipient starts next semester. A single mother, 34, studying to be a paralegal. Margaret would like that. There's something else. Blake's firm is asking about purchasing adjacent property for a client. They want to know if you have any holdings in the area. I did. 12 acres, 2 properties over, purchased in 1988. Undeveloped, held for appreciation. Tell them it's not for sale. They're offering 3 times assessed value. Still not for sale. David chuckled. Understood. I'll draft the refusal. Over the following months, I watched Blake try to change. He completed the wine cellar to Margaret's specifications. I'd given him her notebooks with detailed notes about varietals, storage angles, temperature control. He hung the photographs in the main hall. Margaret at 25, Margaret at 40, Margaret on this ridge with Sarah as a child. He wrote the letters. I don't know what he said in Sarah's. That was between them. But Ruth showed me hers. It was 3 pages, handwritten, acknowledging every cruel word and apologizing with what seemed like genuine remorse. Ruth accepted it. She started visiting 1 weekend per month, staying in the guest room Margaret had designed with morning light and a view of the water. I joined her sometimes. Walking through the house Margaret had created felt like hearing her voice again. In the archway she'd specified, in the breakfast nook she'd positioned to catch sunrise, in the reading corner she'd planned for the grandchildren she'd never meet. Blake and I maintained careful distance. Professional courtesy. He was trying, but trust wasn't rebuilt with apologies and bronze plaques. It was rebuilt with time and consistent action. Sarah understood. She split her time between the estate and a small apartment downtown, working through what she wanted her marriage to look like. I need to know he loves me for me, she told me one evening. Not for the image or the lifestyle or what I represent to his colleagues. That's wise. Did you ever doubt Mom? Doubt that she loved you? I thought about Margaret in the strip mall notary office, signing papers for land we couldn't afford to develop. Margaret working double shifts so I could buy equipment. Margaret at midnight with coffee and drafting pencils and absolute faith. Never. Not once. She showed me every day. I want that, Sarah said. Whatever happens with Blake, I want that kind of certainty. 6 months after the anniversary party, I held a small gathering at the estate, my idea, but I asked Blake's permission since he held the lease. He agreed immediately, almost eagerly. It was Margaret's birthday. Ruth came, along with the crew chiefs who'd worked with me for decades, the night students from Margaret's community college classes, old friends from the neighborhood. We filled the house Margaret designed with the people she'd loved, the simple, unsophisticated people Blake had dismissed. They brought potluck dishes and cheap wine and stories about a woman who'd believed in education, hard work, and taking care of those around you. Blake attended. He stood in the corner mostly, watching, listening. I saw him talking quietly with Ruth at one point. Later, I found him in Margaret's reading corner, looking at the photographs. She was beautiful, he said when he noticed me. Inside and out. I never knew her. Sarah talks about her, but I never. He gestured helplessly at the party. I never understood what she meant to people. Margaret didn't need to be understood. She just lived her values. I've been thinking about my father's firm, Blake said. About the path I've been on. It's not. I don't think it's who I want to be. That's between you and Sarah. I know, but I wanted you to know. I'm looking at teaching positions. Law schools, community colleges. Places where I could actually help people, not just serve clients who can afford our fees. I studied my son-in-law. He looked tired, humbled, uncertain in a way he'd never been before. Margaret taught night classes for 15 years, I said. Never took a penny. She said education was how people built better lives. If you're serious about that path, I'll support it. But you do it for the right reasons, not to impress me or win Sarah back. I'm doing it because I stood in this house and called her dreams quaint, Blake said quietly. And I need to prove I can value something beyond my own success. He walked back to the party. Sarah watched him from across the room, her expression unreadable. I found Ruth on the deck, looking at the lake in the fading light. What do you think? I asked. About Blake. I think he's learning. Whether he learns fast enough. She shrugged. That's up to Sarah. The party wound down as sunset painted the water gold and red. The guests left with embraces and promises to gather again. Blake and Sarah cleaned up together, moving around the kitchen with careful coordination. I stayed on the deck, watching the light fade. Ruth joined me with 2 glasses of wine from the cellar. A vintage Margaret had noted in her journal. To your beautiful, brilliant sister, I said, raising my glass. To Margaret, Ruth agreed, who knew exactly what she wanted and made sure her daughter would have it. We drank as stars emerged over the water. Sarah found me an hour later. Dad, Lake's leaving. I'm staying tonight. Is that okay? It's your house, sweetheart. Well, your house on my land. I smiled. Stay as long as you want. She hugged me. Thank you. For fighting for Mom. For making sure she wasn't forgotten. She could never be forgotten. I drove home through the dark, Ruth dozing in the passenger seat. The old F-150 rattled over familiar roads, past developments I'd built, houses I'd framed, neighborhoods that existed because Margaret had kept the books and believed in the work. At home, I sat with her photograph. The deed was filed safely now, transferred into a trust that would pass to Sarah, with covenants protecting the land and Margaret's memory for generations. She's figuring it out, I told Margaret's smile. Sarah, she's stronger than either of us know. The house settled around me. 3 years of missing her, but the absence felt different now. Not empty, full of something preserved and protected and worth the fight. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, sitting in the reading corner. Found Mom's notebook with the wine notes. She drew a little heart next to this vintage. I'm drinking a glass and thinking about her. Thank you for keeping her dream alive. I looked at the photograph. Margaret at 43 in that lavender dress, standing on a ridge overlooking water, dreaming of a house she'd never live in, but building it anyway for the daughter she loved. That's legacy, not the property or the money or the structures that rise and fall with markets. It's knowing the people you loved carry your values forward, that the dreams you dream matter beyond your own life. Lake might change. He might become the man Sarah deserves. Or she might choose differently. Choose herself. Choose her own path, built on the foundation Margaret and I gave her. Either way, she'd have the land, the house, the knowledge that her mother dreamed something beautiful and her father made sure that beauty was honored. On quiet mornings, I still drive out to the estate. I make coffee in the kitchen Margaret designed, sit on the deck where she planned to watch grandchildren play, walk the ridge where she used to sketch impossible dreams. The plaque catches morning light, her name in bronze, her vision preserved. And sometimes, when the mist rises off the water and geese call overhead and everything is quiet and clean, I swear I can hear her voice. You kept your promise. That's all I ever needed. That's enough. That has to be enough. And in the golden morning light, with calloused hands wrapped around warm coffee and my daughter sleeping in her mother's dream, it is.